Well, hello there. Thank you so much for joining me today to discuss office injuries and how to prevent them in your workplace. My name is Lyndsay and I have been providing sports medicine services for 10 years now. And in my line of work, whether it's an injury evaluation or an ergonomic assessment, I find that I do a lot of repeating myself, simply because people tend to make the same mistakes in their self-care and workplace setup over and over again. I've taken some time to extract these patterns I've witnessed so that I can share them with you today, and hopefully you can then extend them to your workforce and maybe even yourself. Okay, so let's get started with a brief overview of what we will be talking about today. First, I need to define a couple of terms for you to make sure we're all on the same page. During this introduction, I'm also going to debunk a common myth about the body and how it functions that causes many people to take entirely the wrong approach to ergonomics every day. Once we get that sorted out, we will discuss the three most commonly injured areas of the body in an office setting, what usually causes it, how to identify the associated ergonomic red flags for that area of the body, some helpful stretches to apply, stabilization exercises to try, how to improve your self-coaching, and a little review for each. I expect that we can probably get through that in the next 3 to 4 hours or so. Just kidding. We're actually going to breeze through this, so make sure you have a notepad handy. Everywhere I've served as a provider, but particularly in the office settings, I have found that chronic injuries far outweigh acute injuries. And I'm sure you know what these things mean, but for the sake of getting on the same page, chronic injuries occur over time, and acute injuries happen all at once. So for example, an ankle sprain that happens on the basketball court that swells up and gets all black and blue, that's an acute injury. This is opposed to a chronic injury, something like carpal tunnel, that starts at some point but gradually gets worse over time. So what is my point in mentioning this? Well, though there is some overlap, the most effective intervention for an acute injury is not the same for a chronic injury and vice versa. And unfortunately, I see time and time again safety managers, supervisors, and even sometimes other healthcare providers, honestly, applying acute injury intervention strategies for a chronic problem. Have you ever heard of RICE? RICE stands for Rest, Ice, Compression, and Elevation. Well, that is a classic treatment for an acute injury, and if you are automatically recommending RICE for a chronic issue, you are likely guilty of this, and I am glad you're here. That is not, however, the myth I alluded to earlier. It's just a little freebie. Well, actually, I'm pretty sure this whole thing is going to be a freebie, so anyway, you're welcome. All right, anyway, let's talk about the musculoskeletal system for a minute. You probably may remember this from 5th grade or so when you first learned about the muscles and bones, that the bones are the structure for the body and muscles connect bone to bone. So, which of the two holds us up against gravity? Think about that for a second. Okay, so most of us were taught in school that our skeleton or bones are what holds us up against gravity, but if that were the case, we wouldn't have to hang them from those little metal hangers that stand up in the classroom, would we? They would just stand up on their own. So if our bones don't hold us up against gravity, what does? We as human beings are not akin to brick buildings, as we may have been taught. This commonly held mistaken belief does have ramifications when it comes to how we approach ergonomics, posture, stretching, and strengthening. Rather than a brick building, we're more like a tent. We are held up by the proper tension balance of our muscles and bones together. This is why every time I talk with someone about a chronic injury, after we get the initial discomfort addressed and taken care of, I make sure that we apply stretches and exercises to rebalance that tension and take pressure off of the injured area. My work is not done until that is complete. I found that a lot of people think that stretches and exercises are direct treatments for the injured area itself, and it's just not quite like that. You have to put these interventions in their greater context, and in other words, this is why exercises, stretches, posture, and ergonomics are important to be included as preventative strategies, not just in reaction to pain. Continuing with this analogy, let's talk a little more about the human body as a tent. Imagine a tent in the wilderness that's anchored to the ground with a little weight. We're going to pretend that this is a picture from one of my many camping trips in the desert. It's not, because I didn't have a smartphone back when I took this trip that I'm thinking of, and I wouldn't even know where to begin to look for those digital files. But anyway, for the trip I'm thinking of, at this particular location, it was insanely windy, and the storm was relentless, stressing the structural integrity of our tent. Thankfully, the morning came and we didn't blow away. But imagine that the storm never let up, and this tent was assigned to provide us shelter for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, for 20 years in a row. It's likely to get a little worn out, right? And it's bound to break against the pressure at some point. The question is, where will it break? Now, if I told you that the wind always came from the east, does that change your answer? What if I told you that a few years ago I left one of the tent poles out in the rain to rust and it got a little brittle? Does that change your answer? The point of this little trip to Imagination Station is to illustrate this point. Our bodies break down in predictable patterns. If the wind is always coming from the east and there's a brittle tent pole resisting the tension, the eastern facing wall is likely to fatigue first and the rusty tent pole will be the first to break. Similarly, your administrative assistant, or let's say maybe yourself, if you apply the same pressure day in and day out to your neck by answering the phone on the left side of your shoulder and you're not keeping your joints in your neck springy with the right stretches and exercises throughout your career, it's more likely that you're going to have a neck injury than an injury to something else that receives less stress and more care. The last thing I want to discuss before we get into the details on the 3 most commonly injured areas of the body in the office setting is how our body tends to respond to stress before it breaks. Picture that tent in your mind's eye one more time. It's resisting wind from the east for hours, days, months, and years at a time. The east side of the tent is stretched long, and the west side is held short for long periods of time. Now imagine that it has the ability to regenerate and then reinforce itself with thicker, heavier, and stronger fabric. Now a tent is not a living organism, and obviously it cannot do that, but our bodies can. In response to resistance, our bodies very intelligently reinforce themselves with soft tissue, but unfortunately, it encourages the current long and short pattern. It's almost like applying duct tape on the tent while it's bent over in the wind. So when you try to break out of the pattern, like sitting up straighter in your brand new, very expensive ergonomic chair, you are fighting against those soft tissue reinforcements at first. Strategic stretching helps with that fight immensely to break down the unhelpful soft tissue reinforcements so that you can establish a new, healthier pattern. So just to review before we continue, we've learned that our bodies are held up by a tension balance of our muscles and bones, that our bodies break down in predictable patterns based on stress and care, and that our bodies reinforce their functional patterns, good and bad, with extra soft tissue that either helps to prevent an unhealthy pattern or makes it harder to break out of one. All right, so I think we're going to get started on the 3 most common areas of discomfort in the body that I see on a regular basis from workers in the office setting. We're going to start first with the shoulder and neck. Together, they're often guilty of causing pain under the term impingement syndrome, where the rotator cuff muscles in the shoulder get pinched or impinged. Here we have a diagram of the shoulder. You see the collarbone, the arm bone, and the shoulder blade. This space right here is called the subacromial space and is where several muscles, including some of the rotator cuff, travel. When that subacromial space, or in other words, a tunnel made out of bone, gets smaller, the rotator cuff gets pinched. This can cause inflammation and even fraying of the muscle, depending on how long the pinching goes on for. So the question is, what causes this space to get smaller? While certain movements of the arm can cause the subacromial space to get smaller, pinching the rotator cuff, by far the greatest culprit of closing this space is actually your posture. When you slump forward with your head held in front of your shoulders and your shoulders rounded forward towards your computer screen or steering wheel or remote control, etc., the subacromial space gets very small. Sadly, the rotator cuff has nowhere to go, and it still has to do its job of moving your shoulder around to type, drive, or click, and it gets pretty beat up in the process. The funny thing about this discomfort is that even though the problem area is right there in the shoulder, people will often feel pain down their arm or in their neck. And this is because of several things, but one of which is that the subacromial space is also shared by a few nerves. So outside of sheer force of will in correcting your posture, how can we set up our desks so that we are not imposing this damaging pattern? There's one main area I want you to check in on right now to see if you're setting yourself up for a pattern that resists impingement syndrome or encourages it. Here's the question. If you sit up tall in your chair, feet resting on the floor and back straight against your chair back, and then lift your arm in front of you to touch your computer screen, do your fingertips just barely brush the surface of the screen? That's where your screen should be, within an arm's reach. If it's further away than that, you are likely leaning forward in your desk in order to do your work. If it's closer, well, you may need to get your eyes checked. Okay, but there's another question here. If you draw an imaginary line from your eyeball to the screen, would that line hit within the top third of your screen? If your screen is too high or too low, this is also causing strain on your neck and shoulders to balance your head, which is actually quite heavy, and it's creating a harmful pattern. There's one more pretty large ergonomic risk factor that can lend itself to impingement syndrome at your desk, but it actually overlaps with our next area of the body, so I'm going to make you wait on that for a few minutes while we finish talking about the neck and shoulders. Even with the best ergonomic setup, the slumped forward posture can be a strong temptation for the body. It doesn't help that most of what we do in this day and age encourages this pattern. Driving, playing video games, cooking, etc. And as this pattern solidifies, like we discussed earlier, our body actually reinforces it with extra soft tissue in that area. Stretching can be a great way to break that down. In order to rebalance the body and protect it from postures and patterns that encourage impingement syndrome, the most important areas to stretch are the neck and chest. These muscle groups are what are held short, like the west side of the tent. That's why we isolate them. And here's a few of my favorite chest and neck stretches for this situation. Okay, so you can see the lateral side bend of the neck, cervical rotation and cervical extension. The chest stretches, there's the doorway stretch, the letter T stretch, and cactus up stretch. You can generally Google any of these and you'll be able to find plenty of YouTube videos or pictures that will describe how to do these stretches. So far, we've controlled our work environment to encourage better body positioning and lengthen the muscles that get locked short in that harmful forward head, rounded shoulder posture. But now we need to shorten the muscles that have been locked long. In other words, we need to flex the east side of the tent. When it comes to preventing impingement syndrome, there's a long list of exercises that can be helpful, but honestly, this one's pretty effective. I like to tell people to put their shoulder blades in the opposite back pockets. You're not squeezing your shoulder blades like you're going to stick out your chest. You're just setting your shoulder blades back towards the back opposite pockets. Okay, so there's a few tips that I like to write down on sticky notes or as names for the reminders on my phone, just like these ones here, that help me with my posture and positioning while I'm at my desk. It can really help to use these descriptors to help your brain better connect with your body. So now it's time to do a quick check-in. We've discussed a common shoulder discomfort that's called shoulder impingement, how it can be caused by forward head, rounded shoulder posture, and how having your screen in the right spot can help to prevent this posture, chest and neck stretches that can counterbalance this pattern, as well as activating the shoulder blade muscles throughout your day. Now let's move on to our next area of discomfort in the body, the elbow. This is so common, I really do see it all the time. Discomfort starts to occur typically on the outside of the elbow, and it can be excruciating, though oftentimes the sufferer has no idea where it came from. It can get to the point where it's painful to open doors or even hold a cup of coffee. Now, would you believe me that this is actually not an issue with the elbow itself? In fact, this is the result of a wrist muscle misbehaving. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here we have a picture of the forearm. The bony parts of the elbow here are called the epicondyles and the olecranon process. The muscles that move parts of the wrist actually attach all the way up on the epicondyles. The most commonly affected muscles are the ones that extend the wrist. Now, if you're not sure which way is extension, all you have to do is put your fists out like they're on the handlebars of a motorcycle and then rev the throttle. You can even make the vroom vroom noise if you want. Okay, anyway, the muscles that extend the wrist or pull it back into that rev the throttle motion are the ones that are most commonly affected, and that is what causes what many people call tennis elbow. Essentially, with tennis elbow, the wrist is overused, it gets fatigued, and then it tugs on the tendon where the muscle attaches at the elbow. This tugging causes inflammation and discomfort over time. But how on earth does this happen in the office setting? Well, let's do a quick little activity to show you. Put your right arm out in front of you, palm down. Now place your left hand on top of your right forearm. Now, wiggle the fingers of your right hand. Do you feel the tendons in your forearm jumping up and down? Now I wonder, what office activity do we do that requires us to wiggle our fingers like that? Yes, you guessed it. Keyboarding and mousing gets us in trouble all the time with our upper body, and oftentimes the elbow is the one screaming at us. The best way to make sure that your keyboard is causing the least amount of stress possible on these muscles is to set up your keyboard and mouse so that your wrist can be in a neutral position. Neutral position in this case is the position your hand would be in for a handshake, except that your palm is facing the ground so that you can type on the keyboard. This helps prevent excessive wrist extension and thus tennis elbow. So let's check in right now to see if you're set up for a neutral wrist or if you're set up for a pattern that would encourage the very painful tennis elbow. I have two main questions for you. First, is your keyboard at the level of your elbow? So sitting up tall in your chair, arms at your side, is your keyboard the same number of inches from the ground as your elbow is? That's the appropriate height for your keyboard. Second, if you sit up tall in your chair, arms at your side, and then bend your elbows so that your forearms are right in front of you, can you actually type on your keyboard? In other words, can you reach your keyboard if I pinned your elbows to your ribs? If not, your keyboard is too far away from you. Having your keyboard close and at the same height as your elbows or a slight bit lower with your arms at your side will do a tremendous amount to reduce the amount of stress placed on the muscles in your forearm. Also, this keyboard check is exactly what I was referring to when we talked about the shoulder. Having your keyboard at the right height and distance from you is essential to preventing shoulder discomfort as well. However, even in the best of circumstances, we can sometimes overdo it. My first personal encounter with elbow pain like this happened when I went whitewater kayaking in Glacier National Park. I was a novice at this and terrified, so I quite literally paddled against the waves as if I were in a battle of life and death. After the adventure, I did recognize that my muscles were fatigued, but I was too busy celebrating the adventure to take too much notice. The next day, however, my elbows were very much making themselves known. Had I taken heed immediately after getting out of the kayak to stretch those poor muscles, I might have actually been able to hold a cup of coffee around the campfire for the rest of the week. The same lesson goes for you. Let's say you got stuck writing a huge report and typed twice as much as you're used to without breaks. This would be a great opportunity to remember to stretch your forearms and wrists. Throwing in these stretches throughout your day, even during your normal routine, can help a lot with prevention as well. And when you do, the stretch I recommend is very simple. Let's just take a second to do it together. Sit up tall, as always. Stretch your arm out in front of you, kind of like your Frankenstein. Your elbows nice and straight. Okay, and then you're going to drop your fingertips down towards the ground. Now you can apply just a little bit of pressure on the backside of your hand and pull your wrist in towards your body, keeping your elbows straight. You should just feel a little bit of a stretch on the top of your forearm. Now you can flip it around as well. So you can do the same position but palm out, fingertips down, and pull your hand back towards your body. That's going to stretch the other side of your forearm. The wrist and elbow can really benefit from some balancing exercises to condition the muscles and prepare them for the work before them as well. Like I mentioned earlier, when the muscle fatigues, the tendon will take on most of the work and start to tug on the attachment at the bone, causing discomfort and inflammation. So the stronger our muscles are, the more protected from fatigue they will be. You can use this exercise to condition your forearms before you work. So my favorite conditioning exercise is very simple. If you get a large bucket and fill it up with rice and then plunge your hand into the bucket and swirl it around, you will really start to feel those muscles firing. You can try circles, figure eights, and even waves up and down. The lesson we can learn from this type of elbow discomfort is very simple. Sometimes the area of pain is not where the ergonomic problem is. I've seen the same mistake many times. when someone believes that there must be a direct ergonomic solution for the area of pain, and then they miss the point entirely. Don't let that be you. When you are looking at your own ergonomic setup, take care to zoom out and look for clues before zeroing in on one solution. So to summarize, the wrist is often the culprit when it comes to the cause of elbow pain. We can set ourselves up for success by having our keyboards in the right place. And as a bonus, setting the keyboard up properly can also help us prevent shoulder discomfort. Wrist stretches and exercises are essential to include in order to prevent elbow pain, especially after a heavy workload. This last area of discomfort is a bit of a doozy. And I'm just going to come right out and say this. Low back pain is a whole universe unto itself. However, I do see patterns with low back pain, and I'm going to summarize that for you here. When it comes to the anatomy of the lower back, there's one particular joint that can really cause a lot of problems for people. Right now, let's locate the sacroiliac joint. You're going to place your hands on your hips like you're really going to scold someone with the thumbs back towards your back. Now, press with your thumbs until you find the edges of your hip bones towards your spine. Right there where your thumbs are is called the sacroiliac joint. This is where the tailbone, the lower spine, and the hip bones all come together. There are a ton of muscles that come together and attach here, creating movement in many directions. There's a few key players, but I'll spare you the details on that. Like I said, we're just going to talk really generally on this one. As we continue discussing the low back, I want you to think about the nature of sitting down for hours at a time in an office chair. Some of us sit up straight. Others of us sit slouched or prefer to have our feet up. But either way, our legs aren't supporting us while we're sitting. Instead, it's our, well, this is my own YouTube video, I guess, so I can say it. It's our ass. All of the pressure from gravity that is meant to bear down on the strongest part of our body is instead bearing down right on the sacroiliac joint. And to be honest, I don't really care if you sit like the queen. That's still a tough ask for your ass. So truly, the best way to prevent low back pain in the office is to take breaks from sitting. But in reality, I know that can be a stretch. So let's talk briefly about what does tend to happen from sitting for long periods of time. If you take a look at this side view of the hip, you can see the tailbone there pointing down towards the ground. Often we sit right on top of this thing, and in combination with the pressure from gravity, we end up pinching the sacroiliac joint. Furthermore, as we sit, our hip flexors, the muscles in front of our hips near where your front pockets are, they get locked short. As this happens, it often causes a tilt in the hip girdle. This only continues the harmful pattern of applying pressure to the sacroiliac joint, and so it goes, a cycle that feeds itself the longer you sit. And before I move on to the next slide, Mom, if you're watching this, I'm sorry for swearing. One thing that really accelerates the hip flexor tightness, however, is when you sit with your seat too low to the ground. So this time, I only have one question for you. As you sit in your chair, with your feet planted on the ground in front of you, is the angle of your hip in line with or slightly above your knee? If so, you're golden. But if not, you are bound to be making your hip flexors locked even shorter than they really need to be. So, with that, you are going to need to lengthen your poor hip flexors. Again, the hip flexor is pretty much right where your front pockets are. So these stretches that I've listed here should be felt in that area. However, a lot of people don't know this, but some of the hip flexor actually attaches in the front of your spine, near the belly button. So if you ever feel like you are stretching your abdominals in these positions, that's okay too. In order to further rebalance the sacroiliac joint, there's one exercise that I've always found to have excellent results. Remember the tent analogy? When one side of the tent gets locked short, the other side of the tent is bound to be locked long. So it stands to reason that shortening the opposite of the hip flexor would be a big hit. In activating the glute muscles, also known as the opposing muscles of the hip flexors, you can rebalance the sacroiliac joint. Now these exercises are a great idea anyway for anyone who sits for long periods of time. If you think of all that pressure on that massive muscle, it's just not good for them, and they can tend to weaken over time. To tell you the truth, I use glute exercises a lot, anytime I can squeeze them in, because most of the time in this day and age, everyone needs a little more of that in their life. One quick little bonus here that I'd like to include. I know that I said that sitting with any kind of posture for too long can be harmful to the sacroiliac joint, and I do stand by that. But sitting up with good posture does make a world of difference. And something that really helps is to keep your feet planted on the ground. Not only will that balance your weight forward so that you sit up, but it will also take several pounds of pressure off of your back, believe it or not. So to summarize, low back pain is often associated with sitting for long periods of time. This maleffect is increased by the tight hip flexors that inevitably also occur from sitting. To break up this cycle, hip flexor stretches and glute exercises can be utilized. Now that we've covered all three areas, the shoulder, elbow, and back, let's review what we discussed. We introduced the idea that our bodies break down in predictable patterns based on the stress applied to them and their level of care. We discussed the nature and cause of shoulder impingement, tennis elbow, and lower back pain, as well as ergonomic tips, stretches, and exercises for each of them. I also shared some of the things that I've learned that can be helpful in self-coaching. I hope this has been helpful for you so far and that you took some notes. So with that, thank you so much for joining me. I hope this has been useful, helpful, and educational. If you have questions, I'm always happy to chat. You can reach out directly to me at this email address here, and we can set up a time to talk. And with that, I'm out. Have a great rest of your day.